So our next and last speaker is Randy Olson, who's been giving scientists hell for a long time. And his title is Narrative is Leadership.
Thanks very much, Kirk. And yeah, I'm here to talk about one thing only, which is narrative is leadership. And I'm going to start with a couple of short case studies. This is all material that derives from a book that I published a couple years ago titled Houston, We Have a Narrative, Why Science and pretty much everybody needs a deeper grasp of these simple narrative principles. So I think we'd all agree that this fellow is a noble environmentalist. He's dedicated a lot of time and energy to environmental causes. But there's a problem. He's made 2 documentary feature films. And the first one was reviewed by Roger Ebert, who said this movie, despite its noble intentions, is a bore. The second one was reviewed last year in the Hollywood Reporter, which said this noble rehash of things everyone who cares already knows. And the problem here is a failure to tap into the dynamics of narrative. So narrative activates the brain, it motivates the body, and it unifies people. These films, unfortunately, like so many environmental films, follow the template that I call and, which is simply the presentation of information. Here's an issue, and here's another issue, and here's another issue. Narrative involves 3 forces: agreement, contradiction, and consequence. These 3 forces are embodied in this template of and, but, and therefore that we call the ABT. For the last 6 years, I've been developing this. This is the centerpiece for the narrative training program called Story Circles that I now run. I'll talk about in a few minutes. So the second case study is the situation of a guy who has an actually very deep grasp of the power of narrative. And this begins with the template for the telling of a story as described by the anthropologist Joseph Campbell in the last century. And what he said is that a story is basically a circular journey that begins in what he called the ordinary world. This is the place we all yearn to live our lives of total comfort, no conflict, everything is wonderful, there's no problems. When a problem arises, we then transit into what he called the special world. This is the narrative part of a story. And you then head off on this journey and search for the solution to the problem. Now, one of the key characteristics is as soon as you enter into this narrative world, the special world, all you really want is just to find your way back home to that ordinary world, the place of comfort again. Think about The Wizard of Oz. This is when Dorothy lands in Oz. All is as exciting and fun, colorful as Oz may be, deep inside, all she really wants is just to get back to that comfortable, ordinary world. Now, about 1.5 years ago, I found myself repeating this phrase over and over and landing on that last word there and thinking to myself, where was I hearing a slogan which also had that as the last word in the slogan? And I think we all know what I'm talking about. And sadly, there is nothing the least bit funny about this slogan. The tragedy is what happened with the journalists in this country. They failed to analyze this from a narrative perspective. This guy was tapping into 4,000 years of narrative, basically evolution of the brain. These are principles that go all the way back to Gilgamesh. And he was singing a song, not for the intellectuals, but for the masses in our society. And it's a very effective song that he's continuing to sing now. So when I hit this moment of realization, I got very concerned. Now, why did I find this? Why is this a concern? Well, it's because we now live in the information society. It's a different world today than even 5 and 10 and 15 years ago. And again, I fail to see journalists really looking at these communication dynamics from this perspective. So communication consists of 2 fundamental parts. There is the content of what you want to communicate, which is the information, the substance. And then there's the form, how it's put together, and that's what those templates of the and, but, therefore, and AAA are. When I was a kid, there wasn't that much information in our society. It was possible for lots of people to digest information, and accuracy and honesty really were important criteria. But we're in a different world now. There is this fire hose of information screaming at us. The world of science and technology is responsible for creating it. And as a result, the masses, everybody's pretty much forced now to shift from that idea of analyzing each piece of information into looking for these higher levels of organization, and that's what narratives are. And the result is we now live in a more narrative environment in terms of the criteria of how to analyze communication. So that's the concern. And furthermore, we live also, you constantly hear we live in a media society, and media is narrative. The mainstream media will not let you in there unless what you're communicating has a high degree of narrative content, is rich in that ABT. You can't get out there with the and thing and expect much time. So has anybody warned us about what the consequences of this might be? Yes, absolutely. And this is one guy in particular. Michael Crichton, the science fiction writer who wrote Jurassic Park and passed away in 2008. And in 1999, he gave a tremendous speech, the keynote address at the AAAS meeting. You can find it online to this day. And among many things, that speech was a blueprint for how to deal with the anti-science movement that emerged over the next decade. Sadly, the science world appears to have taken virtually no advice from him. There's all these specific recommendations in there that don't seem to have ever been listened to or implemented. But there's a couple quotes from it that I want to share with you that I think are very profound and prescient. So the first of which is this. He said toward the beginning of the speech, the information society will be dominated by those who are most skilled at manipulating the media. If he were alive today, I don't think he'd be the least bit surprised by who got elected president. That's at the core of what's going on now in this world of too much information. And then here's a rather unsettling second quote, which I totally agree with. He said towards the end of his speech, scientists don't understand media. For 25 years, I've been trying to work with scientists on media. They fundamentally do not understand media. Now, why might that be? What I would suggest is I think there's a major developmental element possibly that goes with this. It's only the last decade that neurophysiologists have come to realize that the brain doesn't complete its development until age 25. It's still growing neurons, it's still going through what's called synaptic shaping, other things like that. And yet scientists begin their education in their teens. By freshman year, 18 years old, scientists are already headed down this developmental pathway, I think, where they're bombarding their brain, incubating it in this soup of information that is non-narrative. It's very different from other students that are going down the humanities pathway and reading hundreds of novels in a far more narrative environment. There seems to me there have to be developmental consequences of that. The frontal lobes, the last part of the brain development, is going on in this intensely informational, non-narrative world. I don't know of any research that's been done on this so far. However, I do know about one brain transplant experiment that took place. There was a guy who incubated his brain for 20 years in that science world, the non-narrative informational science world, and then at age 38 transplanted his brain to the intensely narrative world of Hollywood. And that guy, of course, is me. And I have been living in Hollywood for more than 20 years now. And the good news is I've gotten a lot better at narrative. Good enough that I've written 3 books about it, now run this narrative training program. And yet, I can tell that I will never get as deep of narrative intuition as some of the major screenwriters that I've met there who can tell these very complex stories and just have it down at a much deeper level. And I really think that there's a developmental limitation. I let my brain develop in that non-narrative world to such a point that I don't think I could ever circle back around. This stuff is very slow to change. So going back to that slogan, as soon as I hit that realization, it concerned me. My book was coming out. I wrote an editorial about this and teamed up with a publicist from University of Chicago Press with the book. And for 8 months, we tried to get it published, and we got turned away by everywhere from the New York Times, the 538 blog, all of them, most of them sending little comments about, it's just not this simple. Well, it was that simple, and what I feared is exactly what happened. And eventually, the thing that really disturbed me was I could see this was a narrative mismatch. This guy was a heavyweight for narrative, and he was going up against an intellectual, a person who was very, very smart, but all the media was already saying that her speeches were narratively flat. So finally, about a year ago, at the height of frustration, I sat down and searched on Google 3 words, Hillary Clinton boring, and this was the first article that came up, honest to goodness. And in an instant, I knew if there was any one guy in this country that would understand what I was talking about, it was James Carville, the guy who masterminded Bill Clinton's campaign in 1992, because he has this gift, this understanding for mass communication. I wrote him a letter. A friend of mine got it to him. The day that he got it, he called me up and he said, I've suspected for years there was a simple underpinning structure to storytelling like this and but therefore. Never heard it put this simply, but it makes sense to me. He set to work trying to get the Clinton campaign people to listen to me. They didn't listen to me any more than they listened to anybody. So it was this long exercise in frustration for me. However, I got one consolation prize, which was in January of this year. He brought me to Tulane University to give a talk to his political science class, which meets one night a week in his living room there, 50 political science majors. It was one of the most fun nights of my entire life. Afterwards, we went out to dinner with he and his lawyer buddy, and I got 2 solid hours of the Raging Cajun telling me these incredible stories. And he's amazing. I wish the Democratic Party would listen to him, because that's what they're missing, are these narrative dynamics. And he's one of these guys who has deep narrative intuition. And the same thing with our president now. And this is at the core of the broad communication dynamics. So what can we do? Well, the problem we face now, as I say, is it's a new world. And you can think of this in terms of like natural selection. The environment has changed now, and it's now an intensely narrative environment, and there is intense selection for narrative content. And that ends up manifesting itself in who is going to succeed in these different things. As a result, I'm putting all my effort now into a program called Story Circles and Narrative Training. And working with my colleague, Jade Lovell, for the past 2.5 years, we've been developing this. And it's basically a training program that consists of 5 people getting together for 1 hour a week for 10 sessions. And this is what a story circle looks like, just 5 people sitting in a room. It's very tightly structured, regimented, what you go through. There's no lectures, no note-taking. It's simply giving people these templates like the ABT and material to analyze. And what it does is it activates the narrative part of their brain for the entire hour. Now, there are 3 things that we need for this to work. The first of which is the participants. Oh, and by the way, here's some of the people that we're now doing with some of the organizations. There we go. And so 3 main requirements. The participants have to be willing from the outset to admit they have a problem. It's just like rehab. You can't start rehab until you admit you have a problem. And the good news is, particularly the government agencies are coming to us and saying that before we even talk to them and say, we know we have a problem. We're not doing a good job getting our story out. We need to work on this stuff. So that's the starting point. Secondly, it's this word right here of training. And it's about repeated inculcation over time. The one-day workshops for communication need to end. You're fooling yourself if you think you're doing significant things in one day, and you're also sending out a message that this stuff is so simple you can make major strides in one day. Narrative is at the core of communication. It's very challenging, and that leads then to the third point, which is, much to our surprise, when Jade and I started coming up with this, we thought it was going to be happy, fun story circle sessions each week, social hour. Turns out it's pretty draining to spend an hour with your brain activated in the narrative part of the brain. And this is what comes back. 3 weeks ago, I was at Genentech talking to the scientists running the circle there, and they're in their 8th week. He said, it's going great. We're getting so much out of it. But this stuff is like eating Brussels sprouts, which I hate. So that kind of came home to me, and yet I would eat Brussels sprouts if it made me better at narrative. So that's the tough part, is that it really is hard work. Now, narrative, I define in very simple terms in my book as the series of events that occur in the search for a solution to a problem. I'm sure this offends lots of humanities people, but it's a very analytical definition that helps in terms of trying to bring narrative to bear on problems that you're working on. So just to wrap up here, let's take a quick look at these 2 events that are happening this weekend. We have this 3-day summit, and then we have the march happening tomorrow. A year ago, I joined in with Nancy in helping her do a video for this event. And the reason I joined in is because she's had such a clear narrative on this from the very beginning. And using that but therefore template, it's about we've been celebrating Earth Day for over 4 decades, and it's accomplishing great things. But it's focused mostly on the bad news, which can get draining. Therefore, it's time to focus on success stories, which will generate optimism. Now, in contrast, when you look at the march, it's happening tomorrow, and I'm a big fan of what they're doing, and I think it's really the right thing, but it doesn't have a narrative yet. And you can read all the articles that have kind of come at them. And the bottom line is this wonderful quote that I just wrote down this morning from my good friend Shirley Malcolm from AAAS. We were talking about this, and she basically said, this is simple terms. If you don't tell your story, someone else will. That's what's happened. Nobody else has told the story about this because the Earth Optimism Summit has had such a clear narrative. But all these articles about the march, they don't have a narrative yet, and as a result, you see all these articles that have kind of critiqued it. So the bottom line is this session is about inspiring positive action, which is extremely important. But what you have to know is that it's narrative that inspires positive action. I could sit here and give you positivity on and on, but if it's just that and template, I'm just going to bore you, and you're going to get detached, and you really won't get inspired. It's got to have that underpinning structure. It's built really around the problem-solution dynamic. And that is what we face now, which is people that are in power are there because they've got this upper hand on the narrative, and you're not going to unseat them simply through fact-checking or calling them liars or saying this is unfair. The only hope is to be launching competitive narratives. We're in this narrative landscape, and eventually, if you launch the right narratives, you'll start to pull people in that direction and move forward, and that, again, is why I'm such a fan of this event here. So that is the bottom line, is that we're in this world now where narrative is leadership. Thank you.
Why don't you take one of these chairs? I want to invite the panelists up for a speed panel. We have 5 minutes. Sit back and enjoy. What I'd like to do is ask each of the panelists just to make a final statement or a comment about someone else's talk, and we'll start with Brett.
Great, terrific. So rule number 1, never serve on a panel when you're giving a talk with an expert willing to critique your narrative. So Randy, thank you. Look forward to all the tips afterwards. But I'll just say also, first of all, congratulations to Nancy for putting this whole thing together. Bravo. And then last, I just think your video and the poem was just beautiful. So,
thank you very much.
Yeah, trash has never looked so good, man. How about you?
Yeah, in fact, in Mumbai, they say that it was called selfie. Now we call it garby. So people are clicking pictures with the garbage. It's quite fashionable now. In fact, a lot of movie stars, they do that these days. Click pictures with the garbage and put it on Facebook and Twitter. So they say that at least Afroz has made garbage a little fashionable.
Nice. That's it. Did you have any thoughts about other talks?
It was amazing. I think Randy's talk was superb. I think I'll take a cue from you when I do a narrative now, because generally I speak with passion and I'm very intense about it. So I just talk from Ad, but I think I take a cue from him, get the narrative right.
Excellent.
And so was Nancy. Nancy was great, and so was him, yeah.
It's good. And you kind of spilled your beans, but what about the other talks?
Yeah, I think they all three exemplify this central challenge, which is humanizing these issues, and that's what all three of them have. The turtle egg story, I know Faye Crevichet, who came up with that crazy campaign that I used, and I've mentioned in my books and things. It's so powerful, exactly, and just the personal element that you brought to your whole narrative is extremely powerful. And same with her, the video. I'm glad we got at least to see the video of her speaking. And last but not least, what you're doing with this entire meeting here is it's this challenge of humanizing this stuff. It's endless.
So Nancy, I give you the last word.
Sure. Well, Randy actually sent part of the inspiration for a lot of the things that I've done is a cartoon that Randy sent me a long time ago from the New Yorker. It's got this guy sitting on a couch and he's holding his phone, he's talking to his friend, he says, and the caption of the cartoon is, "Making a difference doesn't make a difference." And to me, that's
my sort of humor. Sorry.
That's the essence of the problem with doom and gloom messaging. In fact, social scientists have known for decades that just doom and gloom, huge problems without solutions, causes people to go to the bar. It doesn't cause them to do anything else positive. And so, on the one hand, we have the ineffectiveness of doom and gloom. Even with a good narrative, I've argued that doom and gloom has really reached its limit in terms of motivating people. People don't see what they can do. It's one of the things that's so cool about both of your stories are the stories of what people can do. The second thing is that there are, as you will learn in the course of this weekend, so many examples of things that do represent solutions, that are going in the right direction. Yes, not enough, as we heard in the opening session, but there are so many success stories out there, and this particular event over 3 days is just a tip of the iceberg. And then the final thing I would say, sort of looping back to this narrative structure, is that there isn't a conservation success on the planet that doesn't have an incredibly strong narrative structure to it. It begins with somebody recognizing a problem, the plastic on the beach in India, tormenting themselves, figuring out what they want to do, working harder, obstacles, problems, and then resolving it successfully. If that isn't a story made in Hollywood or Madison Avenue, I don't know what is. So you guys need to tell your stories of success. The last thing I'll say is that we really, as one of the things Ayanna said at the opening, is we really need to widen the choir. Conservationists have often been accused of just speaking to each other and the choir being too narrow. We will have a lot larger choir out there if we start singing the song of success. Thank you.
And with that note, thank you very much.